Okay, let me introduce Nancy and let her go over briefly the legislation that she has outlined and what it does.
Members of the press, thank you very much. The legislation that I'm proposing is based on the New York Alcohol Beverage Control Act, which was initiated when alcohol prohibition was ended. It would require that people who sell drugs or who import them be licensed. It would require that no drugs be sold to anyone under 21 years of age. It would encourage the use of warnings, which would describe the ill effects of drugs, possibly by regulation, possibly by strict liability for any problem that is not mentioned in the warnings. It would prohibit volume discounting. This means that every seller would have one price for all of his product. This way, people would not have incentive to purchase more than they need or to bring their friends with them and encourage other people to use drugs. Through the use of this legislation, we could keep the drugs out of the hands of more young people than today. Today, young people are being pulled into an illegal and malignant criminal enterprise. Why? Because the dealers are afraid that if they allow an adult to work for them, that adult, if he is caught, will have to turn them in to avoid going to jail, while a young person faces less of a sentence. So the kids are being dragged into this by the time they're 12 years old. They never have a chance to pursue legitimate opportunities. This legislation, if enacted, would end all that. It would end the violence. Last year, 438 people were killed on Washington streets. And this year, we are rapidly approaching the same total. Over 70 people have been killed so far. Police are dying in a futile effort to end this plague on our country. And my belief is that regulation and legalization is a better means of putting this problem into perspective and getting a handle on it. When the people of Eastern Europe look to our country, will they see a shining city on the hill, a center of commerce and enterprise, or will they see SWAT teams and yellow crime scene tape? Let's get this country back on its feet. Let's stop diffusing resources and capital into a futile war on drugs that is not only not helping, it is making things worse. Thank you very much.
Any questions? I have one answer of a question that's asked me the most frequently. Last night I was on a radio talk show, and as usual, the question came up, does it not mean that if you legalize drugs that you endorse the use of drugs? Doesn't this send a bad message? That's probably the question we get most frequently and probably the most challenging, because the last thing that I, as a physician and as a parent and a grandparent, would want to ever send is a message that there's something good and decent and logical about the use of drugs. But I compare it to the First Amendment. We all work very diligently to protect the First Amendment. We realize that the First Amendment even protects those individuals who do and say and write things that we disagree with. Who in the world would ever say that we must do away with the First Amendment because people write things that we disagree with or practice religions that we don't agree with? At the same sense that we should protect voluntary private behavior. We legalize private voluntary behavior because it's a principle of freedom, because they do things, individuals do things that we might disagree with. In no way do we endorse it, no more than we would endorse what people do and say under the First Amendment. And I think that is a legitimate answer. I think it's a clear answer, and in no way does it send a message that we want to see further use of drugs, because there's nobody that wants that. What we want to do, of course, is address a serious problem that has gotten much worse over these past 20, 30 years.
I would also like to add to that. I think that these people who say that drug use is going to go way up are talking nonsense. I've met with the drug warriors. I've met Rudolph Giuliani. I've met Reggie Walton. And when all their arguments are finished, they all come down to the same thing, the moral message. We all need the strong hand of government to tell us that drugs are wrong, or we're going to run out into the streets and start using crack. Well, I find that insulting, and I think it should be insulting to all of you. As Dr. Paul was saying, making something legal is not endorsing it. There are plenty of things that are legal in this country that we do not endorse. People who don't use drugs because they know that drugs are bad for them. That is why drug use is declining in terms of the casual user, because people are learning that using drugs is crazy, and we are perfectly capable of learning that for ourselves. It's funny, when you ask the drug warriors, would they go out and use crack if it was made legal? Each and every one of them will deny it. It's always the other guy, someone not quite as smart as they are, who needs to be told by the government to stay away from drugs. Well, I say it's time we tell them no. We don't need this. We don't need children being killed in the street so the government can tell us no. We are capable of making our own decisions.
One other point I'd like to emphasize, I mentioned very briefly in my opening remarks, and that is this change in law, the legalization of drugs, the decriminalization of drugs seems very, very strange to most Americans. I think most of them, when they listen to it and reason about it, they come in our direction, they start saying, you know, that does make a lot of sense. But one thing that they fail to realize is that most of our history, drugs were legal. Up until 1914, up to the Harrison Act, drugs were legal. There was cocaine in Coca-Cola, and we weren't a nation of druggies, and we weren't a nation of prescription drugs. We weren't a nation of tranquilizers, a nation of alcohol. So there is a problem, but the problem has nothing to do with the lack of laws. And I think if people will stop and realize that if America existed when it was a freer nation and more concerned about individual liberty, was able to exist, just possibly we could do it again. Any questions from the audience? If not, I believe we could conclude the press conference.
You made a statement that drug use was not on the increase because you talked to the drug lords.
Yes, the statistics show, when you compare the NIDA data, that's the National Institute of Drug Abuse, between 1985 and 1988, drug use overall has gone down dramatically. The number of people who use cocaine occasionally went down from like 6 million to 4 million. However, the regular use of drugs, which would include crack, has gone up. The use of all drugs went down from 23 million to 14 million. This would be the weekend marijuana user, the people who use drugs occasionally. That has dropped. So what we've done with the drug laws has been trade the weekend marijuana smoker for the crack addict. We're getting more addicts while we're getting fewer people who use drugs casually. Now, I'm not saying reducing casual use is a bad thing. I think it's a very good thing. But again, I don't think it's a result of drug prohibition. I think that people are learning that drugs are bad for them. Obviously, prohibition is doing nothing to stop the addicted user. These statistics also show that not everybody who tries crack becomes an addict. If you compare the number of people who've tried it to the number of people who are addicts, it's only a small fraction.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Good job. Thanks.
Okay, on the ad. Okay, more. Make sure I have it upright. Okay. Thank you.
That concludes this news conference held to respond to the Cartagena Drug Summit. For more information, please write to the Libertarian Party. The address is 1528 Pennsylvania Avenue Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20003. Coming up next, a discussion of the possible reunification of Germany.
Monday on C-SPAN.